There's a new book out, and it's by Laura Dodsworth, and it's called A State of Fear. And it's about how the UK government weaponised fear during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to recommend the book to you because it's thoroughly well researched and it's got an excellent argument about what's going on behind the scenes. I want to read to you just some selections from the book and try to step you through some of the arguments that are being presented so that you can maybe pick up the book for yourself and have a look at it. The introduction begins like this. This is a book about fear. Fear of a virus, fear of death, fear of change, fear of the unknown, fear of ulterior motives, of agenda and conspiracy, fear of the rule of law, of democracy and the Western liberal way of life, fear of loss, fear of losing our jobs, our culture, our connections, our health and our minds. It's also about how the government weaponised our fear against us, supposedly in our best interests, until we were one of the most frightened countries in the world. Then goes on to talk about a group called the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour. No, I hadn't heard of it either until I'd read this book. The SPIB, they produced a report for the government. They're quoted as saying this. They recommended that the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased amongst those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. In essence, the government was advised to frighten the British public, to encourage adherence to the emergency lockdown regulations. And Laura Dodsworth goes on to explain how the government weaponised that fear. The government, public health bodies and the media used alarmist language throughout the pandemic. They used big numbers, steep red lines on graphs, and they used selective information, careful psychological messaging, and emotive advertising, creating a blitzkrieg of fear bombs. Fears are educated into us and can, if we wish, be educated out. We need to inoculate ourselves from fear. And this is the kind of ideas which this book is presenting. Chapter 2 tells us that fear spreads in the media like an airborne virus. It starts like this. A woman in a face mask stands with her shopping bags next to a subway. Suddenly she falls forward, landing flat on her face. She lies immobile and stiff on the pavement. A concerned shopkeeper runs out to check on her. A man is out cold in the street as people in white hazmat suits attend to him. Another man lies face up, body straight, alone in a corridor. Another body, two people attending in hazmat suits. A very wide roadblock is manned by people in white lab coats, masks, high-vis vests. Another man lies on his back in a shop. The area is cordoned off. People in PPE look on. All of these worrying scenes appear in a video which paints an apocalyptic picture of collapsed citizens, medics in hazmat suits, concerned bypassers, and a city grinding to a halt. It was, says Dodsworth, the first glimpse of a new deadly epidemic and our first taste of fear. She goes on to illustrate some other things. Another disturbing video showing people in China being dragged from their homes by officials in hazmat suits. Had they refused to quarantine? Were they unknowingly infecting people? The video tells us the Chinese government had started going door to door with temperature checks. Were these people being taken because they had a high temperature? Is the whole thing real or is it fake? You have no idea, but the video will have played its part in stimulating fear. Headlines referred to zombies, killer bugs, apocalypse. Over and over, these Chinese COVID videos were described as disturbing by newspapers and commentators. And Furthermore, we have another example here. There's the BBC. The coverage of the BBC was brought rapidly in line with the government's ideas of what needs to be done, introducing fear. And we have the BBC's coverage was so remarkably fear-mongering during the epidemic. Telegraph journalist Alison Pearson relabelled the organisation, the BBC, as the Body Bag Corporation. So much fear was it engendering. Here's another quotation from the book. It's all about how the government used nudge theory in order to psychologically prepare us for the coming lockdown and what we would be required to lose. Nudge theory is about denying certain choices or making other choices harder. It's used to avoid having arguments and instead to manipulate people without them even realising they're being manipulated. It's a real assault on people's capacity to make up their own minds. It treats us like mice in a laboratory. If people don't do something, it's not because they're incapable of doing it, it's because they've chosen not to. You might think all of that is a bit sci-fi, but the government has got its own well-established nudge unit for doing that very thing. These SPIBs, they had papers which were quite open about the way in which you had to scare people. In Germany, they had an even stronger effect. Here are two of the suggestions from their equivalent group for scaring the German public. What they suggested, they should do this, two things. Many seriously ill, this is a kind of a scenario in a kind of an advert. Many seriously ill are taken to hospital by their relatives but turned away. They die in agony at home, gasping for breath. Choking or not getting enough air is a primal fear for everyone. The same applies to the situation in which there is nothing you can do to help loved ones who are in mortal danger. It's all very disturbing. And the second suggestion was, children are unlikely to suffer from the epidemic. Well, we must make them think that's wrong. Children are easily infected, even with exit restrictions, i.e. from neighbours' children. When they affect their parents or one of them dies in agony at home, and they feel they are to blame for forgetting to wash their hands after playing, for example, it's the most terrible thing a child will ever experience. These are the ideas of propaganda which are put forward by governments. Besides that, they also make use of slogans. Slogans on government and NHS advertising appeal to heroic altruism. So we employ that. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, protect your loved ones. I wash my hands to protect my nan. I wash my hands to protect my family. I wear a face covering to protect my mates. I make space to protect you. Also, on the negative side, besides appealing to the altruism of people, there's also the negative stick side where they use terms like COVIDiot, emerging early on to describe people who behaved stupidly or irresponsibly. The Urban Dictionary website has a selection of definitions, including this: dour piety. An individual who, in the face of dire circumstances for all, acts selfishly towards others instead of in solidarity and with generosity. All of which is part, says Dodsworth, of the government playbook of fear. Scary slogans were used to, in fact, incentives to deter rule breakers, such as, if you go out, you can spread it. People will die. Don't kill Granny. Coronavirus, anyone can get it, anyone can spread it. Don't let a coffee cost lives. It says here, I felt a whiplash when I first saw the Don't Kill Granny campaign. It was simultaneously insensitive to the youngsters who have lost grandparents and placed a jaw-slackening burden upon others. I felt a visceral and maternal need to reassure my children that they were not responsible for the deaths of the elderly. One son told me in response that a teacher at school had shouted at non-mask wearers in the corridor they were killing people. That such is the way. There's a very interesting section here on the use of masks from the psychological point of view. The behavioural psychologists, says Dodsworth, love masks. They absolutely love them. They believe they promote collectivism, the feeling that we're all in this together. This attitude, clearly gleaned from my interviews with the SPIB advisors, was confirmed when David Halpin answered MP's questions. He said, "It took a long time to get people in masks. Our view early on was that masks are effective, not least because of the signal that they create. Oh, and of course the underlying evidence." So he believed that there was evidence in favour of masks, but note that signal came before evidence. Behavioural scientists push for masks because they created a signal, when in fact not a single randomised control trial can demonstrate the value of mask wearing outside clinical settings. There's another element here. Masked faces are primers to make you think of danger. There's danger all around you, in the air that we breathe and in the people that we meet. They keep fear on our faces because we become walking billboards for disease and danger. Literally, they also distinguish the compliant people from the rebels. That's another thing there. An MP told me off record that the health minister had told him that masks were introduced because of the economic bounce back was not strong enough after the first lockdown. He felt that masks would make people feel safe to go out shopping. Masks were supposed to serve as an economic stimulus to get people out there. However, once we were wearing masks, it became about social control, because it turned out that reinforcing a feeling of abnormal threat everywhere you go, into every shop you see, stimulated fear. And so the reason for wearing masks became inverted. When I spoke to Professor Robert Dingwall, a professor of sociology that advises the government, he told me he was convinced that masks have been introduced partly because they are, quote, a symbolic reminder that people are dangerous, that the world is dangerous, and that you might feel safer at home. They create a sense of threat and danger, that social interaction might be something to be anxious about. So mandating masks can feed the fear. And he appreciated and agreed that there was little scientific basis for masks, and that in his view they were designed just to make people compliant. I asked about the ethics of that kind of tactic, and he said, the ethics stink. The BPS, that's the British Psychological Society, should be taking a look at it, and I'm disappointed that the psychologists have not taken this up. But that, of course, is the problem, says Dodsworth. It's at least some of the psychologists wanted us in masks precisely because they were a fear signal. Dodsworth goes on to make a couple of other interesting points in this book. One is about the flagrant marketing abuse, the breach of the ASA codes by the government, as you'll see in some of the worst doom-mongering ads that have ever existed on the TV. Here's one. A dominant tactic of the campaign was not just to say that you're at risk, but rather, more importantly, the emphasis of the campaign was to say that you are a risk. It's a dark messaging indeed to tell us that we are responsible for killing other people, including our loved ones. Quote, George left the pub. He went home to kill his dad. Sasha had a great night out with her friend's house and popped in to kill her nan on the way home. Once Aid finished keeping fit, he'd go home to kill his mum over dinner. Well, this is a wording from a sensationalised video. Here's one shared by a councillor at Haringey Council. Someone jogging, walking their dog or working out in the park is highly likely to have COVID-19. This is a national health emergency. Around 1 in 3 people have no symptoms and are spreading it without knowledge. So exercise locally. And if you bend the rules, people will die. This government radio advert was withdrawn after complaints of the Advertising Standards Authority, as their claims were misleading and could not be substantiated. However, there was no apology, no correction was ever issued. Many millions of people might still think these false claims are true and be unnecessarily frightened or concerned. Another one. Look him in the eyes. Tell him that you always keep a safe distance. Look her in the eyes. Tell her that you never bend the rules. Look him in the eyes and tell him the risk isn't real. A poster, print and broadcast campaign shows people wearing oxygen masks and looking straight into the camera. The tight close-up and the eye contact are designed to take you straight into their predicament. The grainy processing is evocative of a horror movie rather like the Blair Witch Project. The campaign didn't just leverage fear, but also guilt and shame, and pitting the sick against the perpetrator. Well, the book contains far more than this. It has many interviews with individuals who have been affected by lockdown. It talks about statistics. It gives you everything that you might want to know about the way in which the government has manipulated people in the country. At the end, I'll just mention one final thing here. That is, in Appendix 3, there is what's called the Fight Back Against Nudge. And there are 3 things which it recommends every individual to do. Number 1, to be aware. Uncover the truth, in other words. In other words, understand that your decisions are liable to be nudged and you are being manipulated by the powers that be. And being able to recognise these nudges in the wild is the key to psychological independence and setting yourself free. Being aware, for example, that the government is using fear to manipulate you is the very first step towards spotting and resisting that manipulation. Secondly, he says, stop listening to the media broadcast, particularly mainstream media. The BBC seems utterly relentless on a daily basis. It produces the most morbid and fascinating facts about death and COVID. Can't escape it. In fact, well, the only way to escape it is to stop listening. I stopped listening to the TV many years ago. I also stopped listening to Radio 4 this entire year because I couldn't stand listening to the constant propaganda that was being put out and the psychological manipulation. Stop listening and exposing yourself to this kind of relentless propaganda. And thirdly and finally, the last thing that you can do is to learn to think for yourself. Raise your level of consciousness. Don't accept information blandly. Think it through. Ask yourself whether these things are true. Go and check out the data for yourself. Above all, put them into a context so that you don't get things out of proportion. But think for yourself and don't let the government or the BBC or the mass media do your thinking for you. Laura Dodd's book, State of Fear, highly recommended. It's only £9.99 from Pinter and Martin.